So what I'm going to do now is introduce you to Brett Callaughan. Brett basically is a senior engineer at Malwarebytes and has over 10 years experience in fighting malware front on and behind the scenes. I won't take up too much more of your time, so Brett's going to talk about 2018 cybercrime, what's coming your way. So please give a warm welcome to Brett. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, so I love my bio that they read out before presentations. It's the 10 years keeps getting longer and longer, and my state in security's sitting on about 10 years now, which is about right. But what we've found is the attack vectors continually change, and something I'm going to talk about today is what Malwarebytes typically has once a year towards February. We release a report globally called the State of Malware Report. This particular report goes into the previous year's findings based on the malware detections that we find in the wild. Before I talk about the data I'm going to go through today, I'm going to talk a bit about how we come across that data. We have a free remediation tool. Now, I'm assuming that most people in the room have heard of Malwarebytes at some point. If you haven't, please come past the stand. We'll feel more than happy to educate you on Malwarebytes. Our free remediation tool is available online. It's downloaded between 500,000 and a million times per day. And once it's downloaded and ran, we clean up about 3 million pieces of malware a day around the world. The data we collect from that is information such as the threat found, the region the threat was found in, if it was used in a business environment or a consumer environment, and exactly what the infection looked like on the endpoint when we cleaned it up. Now, Malwarebytes is unique, and we are the global standard for remediation in the fact that we don't just clean the malicious file, we clean the artifacts associated with the malware. Now, those artifacts could be registry keys, temporary directories and files associated with the malware, things like that which malware does on the endpoint at runtime. So all that information gets collected by Malwarebytes. Our labs and research team collate that data into pretty graphs and pictures for us internally to use as a sales tool. But what we have found is that the data that comes out of that is extremely valuable for the industry. So I'm going to talk a bit about the last quarter of 2017 and the first half so far of 2018, what we've seen the landscape do from an adjustment perspective on the attacker's front. And I'm going to focus on 2 or 3 of the key problems that we're seeing ramp up in a big way from a malware family's position. So we'll cover malware trends. We'll cover ANZ, or Australia, New Zealand versus the world. So I'm going to show one global slide on what the top 9 malware families were globally. Then I'll compare that to what we've got in ANZ from our detections from local remediation scans. And then we'll take a look at some of the specifics. So the heavy hitters for 2017, 2018 so far have been cryptocurrency miners and also Trojans, one in particular, which we'll talk about with a little bit of detail. We'll go into the hardware attacks, which we've seen earlier this year hit the press that most of you are aware of. For example, the Spectre and Meltdown attacks or groups of vulnerabilities we've seen come out. We'll touch on them very briefly. If anyone wants to have a really in-depth conversation about that kind of stuff, come past the stand, we'll have a conversation. I'm happy to answer questions at the end, but some of that stuff can drag on, so we might have to take it offline, but we'll see how we go. We'll cover some of the delivery techniques we've seen in 2017. Attackers got creative in 2017. We've seen a big shift away from just using email spam a lot of the time for infections. We'll take a look at some predictions. Now, these are some of my own, some from our research team based on the data we've collected over the last sort of 6 or 7 years from the industry, but also what we've seen from an attack landscape change come out of the results we're seeing here in the stuff. And then we've got some Q&A available as well. So I'm only going to slow the first part of this slide because the rest of it's very marketing and salesy, and I don't like doing that. But just to touch point on that previous point I made, so 500,000 to a million downloads a day of our remediation tool, 3 million remediation events per day. That's 3 million individual pieces of malware cleaned up each day. And the global research teams essentially is the guys that put this data together for us and allow me to present the information. So I'll get rid of the marketing rubbish. Okay. Global top malware families for 2017. This is Q4 of 2017 and the first half so far, or 5 months of 2018, as of yesterday's date. So globally, hijackers are the #1 piece of malware seen. Now, hijackers are anything from browser add-ons stealing credentials via cache, right through to scripts looking at monitoring passwords on endpoints, that kind of stuff. Advertising and malvertising, so adware and malvertising, sorry. Adware is a epidemic, so to speak. It's an annoyance traditionally. It's what we see browser pop-ups be generated by. We see campaigns delivered via adware, that kind of stuff. Malwarebytes has focused on adware for quite a number of years, mainly because we've seen the infection vector heading towards packaged malware. So adware is not just adware anymore, it's packaged with malicious content. So it becomes one of those key things we look for when we're doing scans or remediation exercises in customer environments. Backdoors and advanced persistent threats. These are DDoS attacks. So DDoS attacks are not something that Malwarebytes typically solves from a network perspective, but from a botnet type perspective where there's an agent installed on an endpoint. That's where we sort of hopefully solve that issue. We've seen a lot of that stuff in 2017, specifically around IoT. So we'll talk a bit about that as well. Ransomware, number 5, that traditionally and in 2016 was further up the list, number 3. Ransomware is slowing down in a big way. At the end of 2017, we've seen ransomware drop off to 10% of all threats detected from 40 and 50%, which is fairly traditional and standard when they had very active campaigns. However, ransomware is taking a back seat to cryptocurrency miners, and we'll have a look at that in a moment as well. So we've got spyware, is another one up there. It's always up there. Spyware is one of those things that doesn't go away. It seems to be very persistent throughout all regions around the world. Cryptocurrency miners, we'll go into that as well. DDoS as a service, we'll talk about IoT devices in that particular spectrum and what botnets are being used to on that behalf for DDoS as a service. And we'll talk about the Spectre and Meltdown type stuff and a bit of the hardware design attack vectors we're seeing come out globally that haven't really affected us locally so much yet from statistics perspective, but will do in the short term. So, excuse me, that was the global stuff. Now, everything else we talk about now is purely based on business. There's no consumer data in here except for one slide, and I'll point out what slide it does have consumer data in it. And these are the ANZ-only statistics. So Australia, New Zealand coverage for top 9. You'll see that adware and malvertising is still towards the top. Trojans for us comes in pretty heavy hitting up the top there, and that's primarily the last 6 months has been the Emotet Trojan. Also the Emotet spyware. I'll cover that off in a little bit of detail in a few slides' time. Cryptocurrency is massive for us right now. It is a big problem globally, but locally we've seen a ridiculous uptick in the amount of detections throughout Australia and New Zealand, and this is literally in the last sort of 30 days, and we'll cover that on the next slide. Fraud tools, which are things like monitoring for interception of banking information being sent to online banking, that kind of stuff, credit card capturing, that kind of thing, hack tools, hijackers and worms. Worms being primarily related to things like Eternal Blue from May last year. That stuff's still around and still running rampant through unpatched environments, stuff like that. Backdoors and crack tools, which are essentially accompanying software installers that have little bits of software associated with them to do cracks on Windows software, which I'm sure everyone in the room has done at some point in their life. We see that stuff as malicious content because it can contain it, and obviously it's technically theft, I suppose, but we all do it. So anyway, on to the next one. This is an interesting metric I pulled this morning, and it wasn't going to be part of the presentation until I seen the massive up jump in May, which is this month. So the orange line there is the malware for the course of the year, detections for Australia and New Zealand for businesses only. That's business detections via our free remediation tool. This is not our business customers. This is our free remediation tool. So businesses finding out their existing AV has failed them in some way, go to malwarebytes.com, download the remediation tool, run it on an endpoint, and we're finding malware. So the orange line are those detections throughout the year, so January through to December. And the green line is this year. So we've already seen an increase in malware in the first 3 months of the year. However, May we've seen a jump of almost 1,000% up to almost 60,000 detections in this month. Now, that comes down to two things. One is cryptocurrency miners. The other is the Emotet Trojan. We'll cover Emotet in a moment, and I'll look at our global threat dashboard and show you just how it fits into a 30-day cycle. But this type of thing, if it continues throughout the year, is going to be a ridiculous trend in graph, and it's going to be very hard to graph next year if we see this kind of stuff continue to happen. Now, Emotet itself is a particularly nasty and costly infection to remediate, mainly because it is network aware to a certain point. When it first infects an endpoint, it's going to escalate privileges or gain access to an administrative credentials of some kind from multiple methods. It will then spread laterally throughout the network and is network aware of where it's deployed to. So once you remediate an Emotet device, if you put it back on the same network again where there is an infected endpoint, it will be reinfected within a matter of a few minutes. So it's very important to isolate all your machines, individually bring them back to a clean state and put them back on the network one by one in a clean state in order to maintain that without network connectivity to those devices until you're finished and cleaning. Labor intensive, time intensive, use Malware Bytes, free tool, it'll clean it up every time, but you need to do it through manual mechanisms. From the global threat leaderboard, you can see here, this is purely for Oceania, which is Australia, New Zealand and Fiji and a few islands. In the last 30 days, Emotet has been the third most detected malware in our region with 67,000 detections. This is business only again. The last 7 days it's been the fourth, and it's the 12th over, yesterday it was the 12th because there was a new campaign kicked off yesterday with a forced extension, which we see there second down. But it's one of those infections which ramped up big for May, and being the third top piece of malware detected in May, you need to be up there in numbers, right? And so far it's almost 70,000, and we've still got today to get through, so this number tomorrow will probably look a lot more like 80 or 100,000. The top one on the list there you can see is the Bitcoin miners. Now, I'm going to talk about that now, cryptocurrency miners in particular. So what is drive-by mining? For those of you that don't know, it's a term coined to describe a method in which a piece of JavaScript code is placed or embedded into a web page to perform cryptocurrency mining, and traditionally on user machines without their permission. So it's detected through slow machine state and a whole lot of CPU being utilized in most cases, or by running scans. Drive-by mining was a huge problem in 2017. We were seeing literally 100 million, we're still seeing over 100 million blocks per month from our web protection engine of known websites that have embedded crypto miners. They're not just being deployed or used via JavaScript. We are seeing actual installers being distributed via exploit kits, malicious spam with attachments, but social engineering is being used with malicious spam in conjunction with to send out links to fake news pages with really cool headlines that may have Bitcoin miners embedded with really lengthy stories, which means you spend a whole lot of time reading a whole bunch of junk information that so it's got time to mine on your device. Now, 100 million blocks per month. These are just blocks that we've prevented from our preventative customers. When we're talking about remediation and data we see, it's a significant problem. This is essentially October through till March. This is just for Australia and New Zealand. These are daily detections. So we're seeing upwards of 60,000 detections a day in some cases. And if we take a look at this particular slide here, for the last 30 days, specifically for Australia and New Zealand only, this is business-only detections. The other slide was where I said consumer data may have been included. This one is 160,000 detections of Bitcoin miners. These are after infection remediation exercises. This is not, we're preventing them from running. The prevention stuff happened well before the web blocks initially, the 100 million a day. This essentially is detections we're seeing people think there's a problem on their machine, download our tool, run it. We're finding Bitcoin miners running within browsers or in spyware or in malware or as accompaniment to malware already existing on machines. So moving along, because I know that I'm running out of time slightly and there's a lot of presentation to get through. Hardware attacks. So we'll talk a bit about IoT. We've seen an excessive rise in compromised IoT devices in 2017 and they continue to grow so far, the first 5 months of this year. I get a lot of questions, and it's probably not a question this room would ask, but what is an IoT device? An IoT device is anything with an IP address and or MAC address. And IoT devices in late 2017 were used for the largest DDoS attack in history so far recorded via the Mirai botnet, which essentially reached out to hundreds of millions of IoT devices and essentially waged a war against certain organizations via DDoS. I know a few people in the room here are very familiar with DDoS attacks. That have large networks, and these are new devices which they need to be aware of from the inside threat leading outside, which will be a problem going forward. we don't just see the IoT devices issued amongst individual campaigns. We've seen them used as services on the dark web for DDoS as a service, and also delivery of ransomware as a service-based campaigns. We've also seen them serve as proxies for things like Bitcoin wallets or command and control servers as proxy points to evade identifying individual attackers. So IoT devices are being used in a myriad of ways, which essentially the biggest problem is with the Android or Linux-based IoT devices. Apple Store makes it a bit tough, but there are out there. We've seen a few. And if you look at our blog, you'll see a whole bunch of stuff around the new Apple threats we're seeing hit the market of recent days. So what are the attackers using the attacked hardware for? So we've spoken a bit about DDoS and that kind of stuff. They're manufacturing backdoors inside the hardware as well. So we're seeing whether they use it for malware delivery or other penetrative purposes. Backdoors aren't limited to just software. They're also doing embedded hardware, or they're using RFID chips as in compromised RFID to communicate with surrounding machines and devices. We're seeing eavesdropping as well. So gaining access to protected memory without opening hardware-specific controllers. Inducing faults, which is obviously the main game of an attacker is to cause a problem with a device, so hacking an IoT device and causing faults. But what we're talking about here is not individual devices, but it's identifying faults and then compromising multiple devices and performing laterally spread fault introduction. Hardware modification, so tampering with the hardware, so things like jailbroken software, working out what it can do when a device is jailbroken, etc. Obviously, backdoor creation, counterfeiting product assets, so finding more about the software or the hardware so they can counterfeit the products. In certain countries, we all know that do that. So the other attack vector we're going to speak about with hardware is, for example, the Drammer and Rowhammer attacks, which I don't know why I used the Android icon there for Rowhammer, but the hammer in between is where it sits there. But Drammer was pretty much an Android-based hardware attack. Drammer itself solely relies on the predictable memory reuse patterns, and it's been patched via Android, via the developers, so that one's not sort of too much of an issue right now. Rowhammer is a way for an attacker to repeatedly access specific areas of memory to modify a bit that exists beside or behind to switch it from a 0 to a 1 to change an instruction. That's available on pretty much anything, and the Edge browser and things like that are available to be compromised in that manner. Spectre and Meltdown, these are the ones you've probably heard of in the news. Spectre itself contains 2 vulnerabilities. Meltdown contains a single one, so there are 3 in the group of vulnerabilities associated with this particular problem. It's ultimately an issue with the very concept of what's called speculative execution. I've got a slide on that next, and if you want to talk about speculative execution, that is definitely an offline discussion. So there's no way to patch the Spectre vulnerabilities. It's a hardware flaw that needs to be redesigned. There are ways of patching OSs from how they access it, or using exploits on a device to access and actually commit the Spectre vulnerability. And what we have noted there with testing our own software is it significantly slows down the machines. We used ADW Cleaner with an unpatched device. It runs super fast. You run it with a patched device and it runs at about 30 seconds to 40 seconds slower than it would originally. So there are definitely performance hits to patching. Meltdown, it uses speculative execution as well, slightly different in the way it does things and what it requires. And this slide sort of shows us a bit about that. So Spectre itself can be launched through a browser from a script, whereas the Meltdown requires an actual malicious process running on the device. There's a great paper written by the Google guys that found this stuff. There's 2 great papers on each of them. Anyone that's interested in hardware attack vectors, definitely give them a look. They are ridiculously detailed and way above my head. Spectre itself applies to Intel, Apple, ARM, and AMD processors. Meltdown is just the Intel and Apple processors, as far as what is so far. They both look to gain access to data they shouldn't have access to, so secure data within memory. Speculative execution itself, those that don't know what speculative execution is, in a very basic way, because that's more my speed, to increase performance, processors guess what the next instruction is going to be from an application. So if there are multiple outputs, multiple potentials, they will calculate all the potentials, and whichever one comes up as the actual next step, it'll take that and it's already pre-processed it, so it's fast path. Everything else gets thrown away with no CPU cycles lost. So ultimately, speculative execution is a way for the CPU or processors to guess what happens next. And both these vulnerabilities essentially rely on pulling that guessed information out of the processing space or the memory space to actually find out what's potentially going to happen with an application to gain access to what might be the next steps for that particular application or process running. So what are some of the means and motivations of the attackers? Well, this is fairly obvious. So we see hardware cloning as a big one. Specific areas of Asia do a lot of this stuff. Disruptive services. So ultimately, I'm going to animate all these because they're all obvious. But the potential danger of hardware attacks, including revealing sensitive information, personal identifiable information, photos, emails, passwords, all that kind of stuff is obviously all available via either of the attacks we've spoken about. And it's ultimately the means and motivations behind 99% of the attackers we see today. Delivery techniques. So 2017 was an interesting year, and everyone in this room, I'm sure, is sick of hearing about WannaCry. And I'm sorry, I'm going to say it twice. I'm never going to say it again. Eternal Blue, from a delivery perspective, was a very good and unique way at the time to spread the WannaCry ransomware infection. We also seen it involved with things like NotPetya. We've seen it being used today still. People haven't patched SMB version 1, and we're seeing it deliver miners. And the Retefe banking Trojan is going out fairly heavily right now with a big campaign leveraging the Eternal Blue exploit that, as I said, still unpatched, goes unpatched within other places. So what the spread looked like from a delivery perspective with Eternal Blue. Now, again, this is the last time I'm going to mention WannaCry. This is the WannaCry infection. This is based on the 14th and 15th of May last year. This is 2 days. Ultimately, this just depicts that 1,311 cities were infected within the period of 2 days with an automated attack driven by the Eternal Blue exploit. The amount of spread was ridiculous. It was the first real worldwide global epidemic that we'd seen hit the papers in a long time. Papers. What am I, 80? Hit the media, I should say. Sorry to those that read newspapers in the room. But it definitely made everyone stop and take notice, right? I mean, if Microsoft are willing to release a patch for an unsupported operating system for free, that you normally have to pay for, typically it's a big deal. So, yeah, Eternal Blue is still there. If you haven't patched, it's probably too late, but patch anyway. But yeah, not going to mention WannaCry again. I don't think so anyway. I don't think it's here. Supply chain attacks. So this is not new, but it was a very successful year for attackers when we talk about supply chain attacks. We've seen two key attacks. We've seen CC Cleaner and EL Media player files shipped down from their own update servers, which were Trojanized files. Ultimately, it's a really, really good way of getting a really big deployment of malware or Trojanized files to a group of unsuspecting people that believe their application was just being updated. A very cool process to inject into an update server of a vendor to gain access to their entire fleet of customers or free users, whatever it might be. But we'll see a little bit more of that in 2018, I think. There's a lot of vendors out there which offer online updates, and some of them, obviously, as we see more exploits come out, everyone's going to the cloud. Spectre Meltdown can be used against the cloud to pull memory out, so you never know about passwords. I think we'll see a lot of this stuff come out in the next sort of 18 months. Not something I put into predictions, but I think it's going to be something we need to watch for. Geo-targeting. We've seen three key examples last year. These preceded WannaCry. We've seen South Korea get hit with specific ransomware dedicated for South Korea. You can guess where that one came from, right? There is a decryptor for that ransomware. It was released within about 7 days of the actual ransomware infection, so it wasn't a very good piece of ransomware, but it did its job and made the news as well. We've seen the Ukraine, so we've seen NotPetya, which was focused at the Ukraine. We also seen Bad Rabbit. Did anyone see the Bad Rabbit ransomware? That was a really cool graphic they threw up. It was some freaky horror thing with a rabbit head. It was very, very cool to see. But they were focused on the Ukraine medical manufacturing and accounting firms primarily. But we got the brunt of a lot of that stuff with overspill through organizations doing business with the Ukraine. So we did see a fair few infections out our way, but nothing that was too terrible. We've seen Saudi Arabia. They had some dedicated government-based cyber espionage attacks by using Finfisher. Again, if you want a conversation on Finfisher, we can show you examples and talk about it at the stand. Essentially, it was just a Word document sent around to capture details of individuals on a machine, but also ask them for more information around credentials at runtime. That was at the federal government in Saudi Arabia that was positioned at. Mail spam. This essentially is email spam. We call it mail spam because a lot of it looks like, it's malware and it's spam, so it's mail spam. What you can see here is, and it's a bit of an eye chart for those in the back of the room, but the key reason I got this slide up is that malware is essentially 80% dominated delivered via spam worldwide. This metric has been the same for the last 6-7 years. It doesn't seem to go away. Attackers pushing malware by spam is just constant and consistent. What we do see here, though, is that dramatic drop in ransomware delivery via mail spam. You can see that sort of towards June, which is the middle graph there, the dark blue is ransomware. You see the dark blue drop off way down. This essentially is a shift in attack mechanism or shift in landscape, and it's also a big shift in focus for attackers. What that coincides with in July was we've seen the biggest influx of cryptocurrency miners hit browsers all year. So we think the attackers shifted from extorting money via ransomware to just mining it on people's machines without them knowing. I'll populate this one. So what we did see from a mouse spam perspective was the Office documents, or the DDE Office documents, coming back into play. Dynamic data exchange Word documents with enable editing, click macro, this kind of stuff. Previous to last year and this year so far, we've seen a lot of PDFs, ace.ace files, which is a really old, not old, but it's still used today, but it's an old zip or archive architecture from the early 2000s. We've seen a lot more of that stuff pop up. Zips, RARs are being used to deliver malware in different ways. As soon as you put the password in, encrypts the machine or does nasty things. But just plain Office documents with embedded macros and also using the DDEs to deliver malware is becoming more and more common. More so in the last 3 months. We've seen significant campaigns spread worldwide. And that's not going to change in the short term either. So on to predictions for 2018. So no surprise, cryptocurrency mining fever will give birth to a dangerous new threats. Cryptocurrency mining is not going anywhere. While people go to websites and when people can embed JavaScript, they'll keep maintaining it. It's free money until Bitcoin becomes useless to mine. Now, this is they're not just focused on Bitcoin specifically. They do have Aeon, Moneros, and a bunch of other cryptocurrencies they're actually mining on platforms. It's just a matter of the value versus mining based on number of endpoints they can attack or get access to. IoT threats in 2017 were on the rise. We've seen the Mirai botnet launch the largest DDoS attack in history so far. We're going to see more of this stuff in 2018. People don't think to protect their mobile phones. If you're an Android user, go to malwarebytes.com, download the remediation tool, run it. It takes about 30 seconds. See what you've got on your device. Ads on Android will kill your life, and they will deliver a whole bunch of junk to your device. A lot of which led to Mirai botnet being deployed via malvertising through just visiting pages and seeing ads on social media. We're going to see a continued series of supply chain attacks. So like I mentioned, I did mention it in the predictions, but a lot of vendors out there are moving their update service to the cloud infrastructure. As we see more and more exploits developed and released, we're going to see a lot more of that stuff hit the market in a big way. Mac OS. So we don't talk a lot about Mac OS, haven't done for the last couple of years. We're seeing the Mac OS attack vectors kick up in a big way. We've seen 3 new variants in the last 3 months make it past the in-OS anti-malware product and sort of be able to avoid that and launch and run on a device. Ransomware is still thin and it's based on scripts and using typical file vault or inbound and taking the password off and not allowing the user to see it. However, we're going to see malware and things like Bitcoin miners and browser-based add-ons focus on Macs primarily. The overall landscape shift of Windows versus Mac machines is shifting, so the attackers will just follow that trend. The last one is a bit based on the fact that all my data is based on business, and we're seeing a lot of malware infections hit business landscapes. With the new data breach laws that come out in February, we're going to see a lot more people notify about breaches. If you notify about a breach on a public website, attackers know that you're vulnerable. They're going to go after the same machines, or at least work out how they were compromised, and then go after a competing business with the same sort of applications, for example. I think business leaks will lead to a lot more weaponized zero-day vulnerabilities. Once we see more exploits launched, and we know Shadow Brokers has a whole bunch more they haven't launched yet, that will make a mess of the worldwide malware landscape. And are there any questions?
Can you just
Sure, sorry, yeah. So, look, supply chain attacks are typically based around the fact that a vendor has an update schedule. So what happened was the attackers compromised the update service where the packages were put together and delivered from, and they injected a malicious update file, which all the endpoints in the world that were reaching out to updates pulled down the Trojanized file of the update and ran it as the application, which then meant they could be controlled via the attacker. Both of them were Trojan-based, so there were just control points which they can then deploy other software, manage the device, make changes, that kind of stuff. So supply chain is pretty much based to injecting themselves within a known trusted path of update vendor and consumer or customer, and essentially injecting a malicious file in that path. You can't see the lights are real bright, aren't they? Well, okay. Excellent.
All right.
How are we for time?
Let's thank Brett, please, for the presentation.
Thanks very much, everybody. Appreciate it.